Welcome everybody. My name is Daniel Nicholson. I'll be chairing today's session on behalf of the CRIMT Student Organising Committee. Today's session represents the first in a series of seminars and workshops that we'll be organising this year. I'm sitting on that committee at the moment, along with Cassandra Bowkett, Alyssa Hannon and Evelyn Dion. These seminars and workshops will be examining work, life and their balance in the context of COVID-19 and beyond. The emphasis of today's seminar is academic and is geared towards the wider CRIMT community, but this series will include more practical content as well, directed specifically towards graduate students, but still looking at the relationship between work and life and how they are balanced. This is in the context or on the back of conversations that as a committee we've been having. We are intensely aware of that graduate study can be particularly isolating, even at the best of times, but particularly in the context of the global pandemic. So please keep an eye out for more events that are in the pipeline and that we'll be organising over the coming weeks and months.
The government's proposals, which go out to consultation today, restrict the rights of children.
If you have your microphones on, could you please mute them? That would be great.
That's majorly.
Thank you. We'd also encourage to hear from anybody who would be interested in presenting in this series, or they have a contact that they think would fit nicely into this conversation that we're trying to have. We would love to hear from you. In addition to that, we're also interested in additional ideas on other seminar topics that could be organised in a more decentralised way, depending on the scope and the theme of those ideas. They may be open to all CRIMT researchers, like today's seminar, or they could be just geared towards graduate students. I'll now introduce our speakers for today. Karel Musilek is a sociologist who studies work and economic life in his role as a lecturer at Cardiff University Business School. He completed his PhD in sociology in Durham University in 2019. His thesis, which forms the basis of today's presentation, was an autoethnography of Coliving, and I'll allow him to explain the empirical content of that. But it is worth mentioning, and I know he will insist upon me mentioning, that it is an award-winning thesis. It has been awarded the best critical doctoral dissertation by the Critical Management Studies section of the Academy of Management, and Management and Marketing PhD Thesis of the Year from Durham University Business School. Karel will speak for about half an hour, and then we will have time for questions at the end. Questions can be either in French or in English, and Nicola will be helping with the translation for Karel for French questions. But if they could please go into the chat box just so that we can keep the conversation flowing, that would be fantastic. And without too much more from me, I might hand over to Karel.
Hello, thank you very much, Daniel. I'll just spend a frenetic 20 seconds trying to get my presentation working. No, that wasn't smart. Okay, here we go. Here we go. I've done this a million times, but I'm always extremely nervous when this happens. Not only will I be able to share it, but also the question is always, what exactly am I sharing? You know, what else is open on my computer? Anyway, well, Daniel, thank you very much for introducing me. It is rather strange after seeing you relatively recently to now know that you are across the ocean. So I hope your self-isolation is going well, and I would also like to thank CRIMT Network for making this possible. This is certainly the most attention I've ever been given, I reckon, but also most international attention I've ever been given. So I'm very happy that you welcomed me here, and I'm very happy to know that such an effort to connect scholars interested in work, capitalism, life, and so on exists. Yeah, but without losing more time, I'll get right into this. So as Daniel said, this is essentially based on my dissertation and essentially a paper which we produced from the dissertation, currently submitted and under peer review, hopefully to be published at some point in the near or distant future. Yeah, it is based on my PhD research, and in that I was essentially interested in a very basic concern, which is life. And this is extremely general, but I think sometimes we must remind ourselves of those very general ultimate concerns that we have. Now, when it comes to life, I choose to talk about it partly because I believe that it is something which is quite understandable not only to academics, but to many people outside of the bloody universities that we worked at. Life is something which I think people understand that we are given, something that they can relate to some degree. Also something which has this ultimate existentialist dimension, right? We are all aware of its finitude. And I also think we are all able to evaluate it to a certain extent. We all ask ourselves questions whether life is good, whether life is bad, or whether life can be better. Now, this is to some degree inspired by C. Wright Mills, right, who says famously that neither the life of an individual nor the history of a society can be understood without understanding both. Now, I choose life as a kind of window into society and into further wider processes, partly for that reason that life is something that people think about and which is intuitively understandable. So if you will, I use it as a kind of frame of analytical reference. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm necessarily naive about it. I'm not talking about life as some kind of unspoiled, beautiful entity which is pure and protected from social forces, but rather I understand it to be, following Marx, always shaped to some degree by the conditions of production, which are always at the same time conditions of reproduction. And on the other hand, I understand it as an object which is shaped by power, following Foucault and his writing about power over life. So this is the ultimate concern. What is happening with life in capitalism, essentially? Now, obviously, for the purpose of finishing PhD and getting papers published, we had to come up with much narrower problem. What we are asking ourselves in this is essentially what happens to life in whatever post-Fordist neoliberal society, where, and I think we are all aware, and these things are rather well covered in a sociological literature, that life is currently under quite a bit of pressure. We talk about intensification, we talk about problems arising from spread of non-standard and precarious employment, we talk about difficulties in social coordination, we talk about transgression of work-home boundary by different communication technologies, we talk about increasingly challenging conditions of social reproduction, which are making our lives somewhat challenging. Now, we wanted to essentially ask a slightly different question, not what makes life hard, but what essentially sustains lives in its exploitable and challenging form. And why perhaps the things which are challenging are accepted, or at least not challenged to higher degree than they are. After all, we need to realize that these pressures are occurring without much noticeable resistance, at least without the economic logic of our existence being challenged by considerable part of our societies. Now, we are essentially interested in this question, and we believe that there was not much attention paid to it in the past, and we, as always, blame our theoretical enemies, or rather our theoretical friends. And we say that partly this has to do with the kind of dominant perspectives we used to think about life. One of them is very familiar, and it is work-life balance, right? Essentially the perspective which is widespread both in academia but also in policy and government writing, which we could simply say sees as its main problem or concern a balancing of paid employment and the rest of life. Now, this perspective essentially imagines life as being something separate from work, something which can be balanced with work. So essentially life encounters work as a kind of external force. Now, there are some empirical problems with this perspective. Also, for example, it focuses too much on the issue of time, which is mostly an issue for middle classes, but leaves out things such as underemployment and financial hardship. It doesn't quite capture those situations which are characterized by non-standard employment, where the logic of balance doesn't quite apply, and so on. Well, there is, we could say, more critical perspective, which we would call the encroachment or colonization perspective, which essentially says that the problem is that work increasingly breaches the work-life boundary. So work is increasingly colonizing or capturing life. And authors explored this in different dimensions. For example, how management ideology increasingly instrumentalizes life, how our life is increasingly sucked into the workplace through kind of controlling of our sexuality, cultural taste, emotions by our employment organizations. There is argument about our lifestyles being increasingly incorporated into brands, and so on. And there are obviously some empirical problems with this as well. It's difficult to say whether these are things which sadly started to happen with onset of neoliberalism, of post-Fordism, or whatever you want to call it, as things like control of personality and emotions, control of behaviors outside of the workplace, control or organization of leisure and reproduction were definitely happening before that. But empirical problems aside, we think that the perhaps most fundamental problem, at least from our perspectives, is ontological one. And it has to do with how these perspectives actually conceptualize what life is and in what relation it is to work. You would say that both perspectives essentially portray life as something which is external to organization of production and which can be either balanced or encroached. Well, with that, we disagree to a certain degree, and we would argue that life as such never existed as an entity separate from work of production. And there is a body of sociological, social theoretical writing supporting this. Again, Marxist and Marxist feminist scholars would argue that the processes of reproduction, which we quite often take to mean life, are always partly influenced by organization of production. We also know from Lefebvre and other writers that things such as leisure and sociality, the way we spend our free time, is always influenced by the organization of production and consumption, and so on. And finally, the kind of built structures in which our lives unfold are to considerable degree shaped by imperatives of capital accumulation and so on. So what we are trying to say is that life is not as much balanced or encroached, but rather constituted within relations and infrastructures of production. And this is something we are interested in. So we are asking, how is life transformed or changed, reshaped to absorb the pressures of work? Now, the kind of perspective or conceptualization that helps us to do that is forms of life. Now, this concept has a long tradition in social theory. Wittgenstein, Agamben, other writers talking about this. But Our chosen one is quite recent, book-length elaboration by German critical theorist Rachel Jägi, who defines forms of life as habitualized modes of conduct with a normative character that concern the collective conduct of life, although they are not strictly codified or institutionally binding. Now, based on that book, we essentially produce a little analytical framework. So what we are interested is how work changes social practices, the kind of stuff of what people do, the logic of everyday functioning. We are also interested in describing normative conceptions of life. What is good life? And again, how this can relate to work and life. And finally, we want to analyze social and material arrangements and infrastructures in which our lives unfold, and how all these three things essentially can be said to be changed or transformed in relation to work and economic logic of life. So what I did empirically, I essentially decided to explore this phenomenon called co-living. If you haven't heard about it until now, I wouldn't be surprised. Many people haven't. Co-living at the most basic level is essentially a community where similarly minded people live together in a specially arranged or purposefully built accommodation. Now, co-living is often described as intentional community of people with shared orientation towards success in entrepreneurial or professional life. And the kind of target audiences, or rather target customers or target patrons or inhabitants, are described often as entrepreneurs, creators, tech workers, professionals. Well, your typical San Francisco, London crowd of startup workers can be part of it, I believe. Now, these co-livings, it seems to us, based on research and such, essentially promise to have two main effects. First one is to maximize chances of success in entrepreneurial and professional life, in a sense that living with other people who have knowledge of entrepreneurship, with other people who are professionals, can lead to, sharing knowledge, motivation, giving each other advice, and so on. So essentially concentrating people who are focusing on becoming successful in their working life can lead to maximizing the success of people living with them. But there's also this other thing. I think the other promise of co-living is essentially that the kind of busy life that these people live can be made attractive or livable by special arrangements of life that are characteristic of co-living. And that's the bit that I want to focus on today, and that's essentially what I will be describing. Now, co-living is very recent or kind of ascending phenomenon, but media are noticing, media from New York Times, Guardian, and others are noticing this as a growing trend. And recently, co-living also attracted significant investment from a major player in what could be called new or entrepreneurial economy. So we will see where that goes, whether there is potential for growth or not. But it seems to me that co-living is now becoming a sort of business model to be reckoned with. So what did I do essentially with my research? What you see is a kitchen of a co-living space located in a European country where I conducted my ethnographic fieldwork. I essentially lived in co-living space for the purpose of my research for around 3 months and shared a house with 21 entrepreneurs across 4 apartments. And I think, as you can imagine, as someone trying to do ethnography, I was observing, noticing, interviewing, and so on to essentially describe or understand what is going on in co-living. Now, what you see is not really, extraordinary. We could say that this is essentially a rather ordinary kitchen, not very different perhaps from a house shares that many of us are used to. Well, what makes this place rather different from any other place I lived in, and I've lived in quite a few house shares during my life, is that it is quite selective. Now, only entrepreneurs, only people with quite significant entrepreneurial experience are allowed to live there. And this is essentially ensured by a formal process of selection, where what people are interested in is finding out whether people have knowledge, experience to contribute to other entrepreneurs living in co-living space, whether they can contribute to that kind of shared environment, shared motivation to achieve entrepreneurial success, and whether they can essentially contribute the entrepreneurial spirit to the collective effort. What is also different to a certain degree is that life in co-living is to a certain degree formally organized. That means that some events are set in place to ensure kind of minimal interaction between residents. Most important are common dinners every 2 weeks. Everyone in co-living would have a dinner together to keep the community going or keep the community bonded. Once a week, there would be a smaller dinner in individual apartments. There would also be a range of networking and knowledge sharing events, sometimes with guests invited from outside, all of them kind of with relevant entrepreneurial experience, and so on. Yeah. So this looks like a normal kitchen, but I think the place is rather unlike to at least most places where I lived. So how does life in co-living look like? Well, I think important principle is to realize that it is organized to a large degree around the nature or ethics of entrepreneurship. Well, in life of my participants, this would often mean that it is characterized by extremely long working hours, nights, weekends, sometimes even working during a party. Well, this was also connected to a practice of bootstrapping, with quite a few of my participants being engaged in bootstrapping, which is essentially a combination of a day job, which you do during the day, and you use income from that job to fuel or finance your startup activities. So as you can imagine, this was a living situation for rather busy people. This is how one of my participants would put it. We are always in, we are never out. You are still thinking about it. You are selling or you are recruiting. You are still in that mode. It's not like football. Like football is demanding, but you can only play 90 minutes and there is only so much training you can do. Now, I always say that this is not exactly accurate description of life of professional footballers, who I think are also always in, but is quite an accurate description of what was going on in life of my participants. I would say this sense of busyness was always present. Now, what is the kind of normative conception of life in co-living? What is the kind of ideal of life in co-living? I would say that it was characterized by this idea that professional life can be arranged in such a way that both professional success and enjoyment of personal life can be maximized. There was not that much the idea of balance, of balancing work and life, but rather there was this idea that if you organize your life and your work in a particular way, you can achieve maximum satisfaction in both. So again, not much emphasis on balance, but rather thinking about how you can arrange maximum work and maximum enjoyment after work into one kind of big whole. So the idea was that, there is a kind of connecting tissue of experience, passion, and energy that you can maximize. This is how, again, one of my participants, Kirsten, expressed this. People in Habitat work a lot. I don't think it's about balance. I think it is important for people to do what they get energy from, what they find a purpose in. It can be spending time with friends, but it can also be working. I think many people in Habitat actually get their energy from working on startups, so I don't think there is actually a balance. It's more about doing what you like. So again, you see, rather than balancing, it is about combining and about finding the passion, and it doesn't necessarily matter whether it comes from work or from whatever kind of leisure pursuits you might want to engage in. Now, as I said, kind of intense work and excessive work imposes certain strains on inhabitants' social life. In these conditions, working a lot on your startup project, organizing social life outside of work becomes rather difficult. I mean, some of my participants would tell me that simple things such as organizing a dinner, going for a pint, sometimes even going for a date could be seen as too time consuming or too energy consuming. And that would essentially reduce the time and effort you can invest into your entrepreneurial pursuits. Now, for this problem, co-living offers a solution. As again, my participants would notice, or that also the way how the organization would describe itself is essentially that it comes with social life which is automatized or rather built into the housing situation. What do I mean by that? Well, living with other people who have similar interests and who are in similar situation, that means that you don't necessarily have to spend time organizing your social life after work, because you essentially live in a place where social life is inbuilt. Now, again, this is how Kirsten perceived it. With all the stuff that I do, it's a problem of how do you have a social life without having tons of time to do that. But when you're here, you come home from work and you are with people that you trust and you have conversations with. It's all just there when you get home. You don't have to go out and look for it. Like, I couldn't personally make a lot of appointments to meet with people and go out for drinks because I just don't have time in my schedule to do that. So yeah, essentially the kind of arrangement of life is offering easily accessible socialization for people who are a little bit too busy to schedule appointments like we would normally do, I believe. Another thing that I've noticed is that, there is kind of distinct temporal structure, or rather thinking about time in co-living, which I would call that life in co-living is carefully moderated. Now, what I mean by that, I mean, entrepreneur or not, our days only have 24 hours. Now, how do you go about essentially making sure that your days include not only work, but also some degree of socialization? Now, when researching co-living, I noticed that life there is carefully moderated. Carefully moderated in a sense, or rather carefully, because great care was invested into making shared moments as enjoyable as possible. Now, life there was carefully moderated because the time spent enjoying these leisure occasions was carefully restrained by inhabitants to prevent excess of leisure to threaten the prospect of success in entrepreneurial ventures. For example, during my fieldwork, I've noticed that the dinners we organized together were quite often meticulously prepared. And what you see on the picture is example of that. That's a dinner prepared for the inhabitants of co-living space. But what seemed to me is that the kind of energy and time invested into preparation of these things was not always necessarily reflected in the amount of time spent enjoying those events and company of others. Now, my own experience when it was my turn to prepare dinner with my housemate was kind of typical of this. Preparing dinner for 20 people is quite a feat, and it took us, I would say, entire day essentially to make that happen. It was kind of great occasion, but then I noticed that people started to leave rather soon after enjoying their meal. We would see people leaving sort of 1 hour after we began. Now, when I asked a friend or asked a participant, where is he going? He replied that he needs to return to his to-do list. Now, so there was this idea that we can and should spend time together, but we should also be aware that the time we can spend on these occasions is limited, and is limited to great extent by entrepreneurial and work concerns. Now, what I notice also that this kind of idea that this is normal and that this is perfectly acceptable was very much accepted throughout co-living. This is how I try to confirm with the participant. Well, Karel, you need to realize that people are very busy here and that they have a lot to do. Everyone understands that. I have a lot of work myself that has to be done today. It was on Sunday. And people understand that you have to work and we cannot hang out the entire day. Well, to that I replied, it seems that at those occasions everything must be perfect. To which Kirsten replied, well, not necessarily perfect, but it has to be meaningful. It has to be worthwhile. So there's this idea of, rather concentrated time of enjoyment, which is invested into and which is taken seriously, but is also simultaneously limited when it comes to sort of excess time. Now, the final point I want to make about life in co-living is that life in co-living is understood in a specific way. Well, I described essentially how, co-living or the kind of social environment that I was describing shapes norms and practices of life, but this also has a little bit more intersubjective, affective dimension. Well, my participants quite often said is one of the biggest contributions of co-living to their life is this kind of ability to have conversations, or what they would say, deep conversations with others, and that they feel understood. Now, this essentially means that you live with other people who are living similar lifestyle, who understand what does it mean to be entrepreneurs, and who understand the kind of sacrifices you need to make, who understand stresses this involves. And they can offer advice, they can lend an ear, they can offer understanding that you would be hard-pressed to find outside of co-living or entrepreneurial community. So you are essentially surrounded by other people who understand your lifestyle, do not question it, but can provide support. I think if you want to imagine this, try talking about your PhD with your parents and see how much understanding you get there when it comes to specifics of presses and so on. So this is again how one of my entrepreneurs put it in his words. If entrepreneur gets an investment, he needs people who will not just say, great, well done. You need people who shout, fuck yeah, and who will celebrate. People who understand the difficulty of running of startup and significance of events like this. On the other hand, when things go wrong, you need people who cry with you, people who will cry with you when you lose an investor, for example. So there's this emphasis on people who understand what is it like to be an entrepreneur, who understand the significance of events, and who are able to provide emotional support just in case something goes wrong, and something often goes wrong when it comes to entrepreneurship. Well, this is just a very simple summary slide. I'm also realizing that I'm almost out of time, or out of time completely. So I just want to say that what we are trying to say is that we need a different conceptualization of work life, which is not necessarily based on balance or encroachment, but rather the one which allows us to explore a change in the form of life and understand how our lives are transformed in relation to work and changing conditions of production. Now, I don't believe this is necessarily just a thing about co-living. Perhaps co-living is a case which allowed me to see some of these issues most clearly, because they are very much concentrated in that, or take their extreme form. But we also see different practices such as wellness, well-being, compensatory leisure, and other things, which are increasingly popular and spread throughout the general population. And we believe through these practices, we see how life is transformed in its form and in its meaning. Finally, what we want to reflect on is kind of normalization and reproduction of work's demands at the level of practices and arrangements of life, which should help us to understand how are our lives not only balanced or encroached, but fundamentally transformed. Yeah, that's it for me. So thank you very much to everyone who managed to pay attention. And I will now try to stop sharing my screen, but I'm not exactly sure how to do that.
Thank you so much, Karel. That was fantastic. I think it's kind of exciting for me to see your research develop, and each time I talk to you about it, there's new and interesting insights developing. So that's quite exciting for me as well. We'll open the floor to questions now, but I might jump in and abuse my position as the moderator and ask you a question first. I guess one of the classic questions of critical management studies is, why do workers submit to their own exploitation? And in this instance, I guess we're talking to some degree about self-exploitation. You had a quote from Marx and a quote from Foucault at the beginning of your presentation, and I wonder to what degree, in addressing that question, why do they submit to their own exploitation? To what degree you think that is ideological, and to what degree you think it is a material factor?
No, thank you, Daniel. That's excellent question, and that's something, that's not something I can necessarily answer. I think that's something we all continue to struggle with a bit. In other bits of my PhD, I try to understand this, and I'm, as always, that's kind of, as my weird relationship with Marx and Foucault, as I can't really decide which one I like more, and I refuse to give one of them up. I'm trying to say exactly that it is a combination of both, right? In this situation specifically, I mean, the kind of entrepreneurial ideology, that Boltanski and Chiapello talk about, that, entrepreneur of the self, that Foucauldians, Nicholas Rose and talk about, is definitely very important. I would say it's almost like a pool. That's why people say, oh, this crazy form of life is what I actually want to do. The kind of idea that through our activities we can better ourselves, we can improve the world, and so on. I think once you are in there is also a strong push, right? And entrepreneurs need money to live, as the rest of us. And I think it is the kind of practical worry about, how do you support your life? How do you also support your business? The practice of bootstrapping, having a day job to make it happen, or the kind of frantic search for funding from different venture capitalists, different foundations, is what actually makes life intense. So I think it is a combination of the kind of normative, ethical pressures, or pulling factors, and the kind of structures of competition, structures of reproduction that are there. I'm not sure whether my participants would acknowledge or say that this is a relationship of exploitation, right? Because they see themselves as heroic entrepreneurial subjects who want to make it, and that is admirable vision. But yeah, sorry, I got lost in it, so I'm going to stop now. Thank you, Daniel.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you. I'll now open to the rest of the people in the room. If anyone would like to either unmute themselves and ask a question, or put a question in the chat for Karel.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It was really, really interesting. Listening to you talk about entrepreneurs, it struck me that there's like a lot of similarity between these and like young professionals, for example, early career researchers. I know that maybe not in the co-living, but at least in a lot of the descriptions of how they view life and work and the overlap, there seems to be a lot of synergies there. And I just wondered, what were your thoughts on what your case about co-living speaks to a broader movement in the way that we kind of engage with work and life, and how that there's this bleed across those boundaries, for particularly for professional occupations where people really are passionate about what they do. I guess I'd like to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on that, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, that's an interesting question. I was actually trying to think about what makes entrepreneur and PhD student slash early career researcher similar. And there might be the kind of interest in knowledge, right? Or for entrepreneurs, interest in innovation, interest in improving the world. And I think to certain again, the kind of normative pool, right? We believe that we are doing something which is worthwhile, something which transcends us. But we also know that that's not all there is, right? It's one thing to feel like, oh my God, I'm shifting frontiers of knowledge here. When you start working on Monday, it's different to think you are contributing to amazing new knowledge when you are hangover on Thursday morning after a difficult Wednesday night. So what keeps us going, I think, is a similar structure in which we operate. You think about the kind of PhD life, you are not supervised, essentially, right? There's not boss breathing on your neck telling you, well, unless you do this today, you are in trouble. We are quite often sort of self-motivating in that respect, but that doesn't mean that we do not operate in economic structure of certain kind. At the end of the PhD, funding runs out and you need to find a job. You need to justify your existence by different things. And we are essentially involved in the kind of creation of human capital, right? In our case, publishing articles, presenting at conferences, not being able to say no to different opportunities because we believe we need to be collecting these bits to make ourselves employable. So I think that, again, similarities both ideologically, but also the kind of speculative situation in which we are, right? Where every kind of activity should lead to potential gains in the future. And this is a kind of approach to oneself that we are increasingly asked to adopt, not only when it comes to work, but also when it comes to our financial situation, investment, real estate, and whatnot. So I think this kind of speculative subjectivity is what connects us. I hope I answered your question at least a bit, Cassandra. Thank you.
Karel, I'm not sure if you can see the chat box, but Caroline asks, what is the average age and age range of co-living residents? She's curious about how limiting oneself to a very narrow selective social circle might affect work-life balance and social life into one's 40s, 50s and 60s.
Yeah, no, that's, again, a fantastic question. And this is something I did not really have time to elaborate on. But it seems to me that at least in the co-living space, which I explored, it was a particular life cycle phenomenon. I can't really give you average age, but I would say the kind of normal situation is late 20s until late 30s. I think that would be the kind of, most common situation in which people lived in this co-living, kind of after university, but before a kind of family life, if people want to pursue it, kicks in. So that I think there was an understanding that it is a particular stage of your life when you want to give it all and make it, for which co-living is appropriate. The most common reason to move out was essentially when people met a significant other, someone with whom they would want to take things into next level and move in together and perhaps have children. Now, what is quite interesting is that there were also speculations about my participants. I talked with some people who already moved out precisely for this reason. And there was desire to return to something like this, but a version of co-living which could include both entrepreneurial workers and their families, including children, because they were unhappy about losing that type of community which understands the lifestyle and motivates each other. I'm curious about how limiting oneself is very nice. Yeah, I don't know what does it do for the future. So I can't really answer the second part of that question. But Caroline, please, if I didn't answer it, then drop me an email and I'll try to speculate a little bit more convincingly. Yeah.
It's interesting, Karel, you said, I think, linking Caroline's question to Cassandra's, the age bracket that you're talking about is very similar to graduate students and early career researchers. It was something that struck me. Justin asks, in your experience with these entrepreneurs, what were their broad long-term goals? Was there variation in these goals a potential influence for them to behave differently in the co-living space?
Oh yeah, I know. What was that broad long-term goal? Okay, that's complex. I mean, the kind of long-term goal was usually to make it, right? To achieve a degree of growth of your startup enterprise, which, you know, is important. Now, there's this fantasy of change of the world through entrepreneurship, but also achieving essentially such a, you know, revenue or business which has such a big revenue that you are essentially at least partly shielded from everyday concerns of this kind, and when you can apply yourself to other things. It was not essentially an idea of you know, winning so you can leave the situation. There was idea of making it in entrepreneurship, winning, and then have more freedom to do what you want to do within entrepreneurship, right? Starting that kind of social enterprise that you always wanted. I think it again reminds me of kind of academic talk, right? Well, now I need to survive this, but then once I get a job or once I get a grant, I will finally be able to do what I always wanted. Was there variation in these goals of potential influence for them to behave differently in the co-living space? No, I don't. I just don't know what to answer to that, so I'm not going to pretend. I think I would need to go back to my data, I guess, to explore that. But Justin, again, if there's if you want to send me an email if you are interested in this, I will try to answer more coherently in text.
I think Evelyn has her hand raised.
Thank you very much, Karel. It was really interesting. And I like the way you questioned the concept of work-life balance itself. And I was wondering, since then, have you been reusing this new conceptualization that work and life not actually meet, but they're always intertwined for other worker categories, maybe? Because I think it's a really interesting way of reframing the discourse around it.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, no. The answer is unfortunately no. Since I finished my PhD, I was I started a new job and it was teaching online ever since. At least that's how it seems to me. And what I'm trying to do is now to publish the bits from this research. But it was ambition of mine for a future project to do a kind of study of contrasting forms of life or contrasting a kind of lifestyles or contrasting work situations and how they impact on things. I mean, one important thing I think now is the sort of emergence of non-standard employment and the kind of hyper precarious life where the work-life articulation, as some people call it, is very different, right? Where we can't really talk about, well, I balance my life with work when you are working 6 different jobs. Then I think it's very different activity from balance again. But yeah, I didn't really manage to do any kind of further project on this. But yeah, if you are interested in doing something together and if you have ideas about a group of people to whom who should be studied perhaps from this perspective, then please do get in touch. I would be really interested in hearing what are your ideas.
I think there may be another hand raised and I can't find who it is. If you want to jump, if somebody wants to unmute themselves.
Catherine Parsons.
Yeah, it's me. Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks, Karel. And saying, just to echo what Daniel said, it's really fascinating to see how the research is kind of developing over time as well. So it's great to get an up-to-date presentation on it. I was just wondering, because you referred there to the participants applying for a place to live within the apartment, and also you referred to the organisation. I was just wondering, from a kind of power and control dynamics perspective, who and how was managing the psychological contract, if you like, managing and making sure that everybody was abiding by the rules for co-living together, and whether you observed any sabotage at all. Assumingly there were different startup companies being created here. So how and who kind of managed to make sure everybody was abiding by the rules and disciplined those who potentially were up for sabotage or to not obey the rules?
It's an interesting question. I mean, so the co-living that I explored was very much grassroots, run and managed by a community of people. It wasn't a kind of large commercial project. And there was ultimately a chairperson and what I think would be called something like executive board, which was, tasked with different kind of areas of collective life. Quite interestingly, they used very business language for that. So they would have a chief experience officer, for example, right? which sounds. I'm not sure to what extent was that partly. To what extent was it supposed to be entertaining, and to what extent was that taken seriously? But nonetheless, that's the kind of terminology that was used. Whether I'm not sure if there were any kinds of sabotage. I haven't noticed that. If you mean different startups potentially competing with each other, then I don't think there was a mechanism to avoid that, in a sense that existing inhabitants had a right to reject person from joining. This veto power to prevent that. There could have been different reasons, but this was perhaps the most important one. So if you felt that someone is too close, that there could be a direct competition, that could be a problem and a valid reason for essentially not admitting them. Because it seemed to me that once people were in, it was very collaborative place. Once people were in, you are ours, and we are helping each other. There was almost this kind of, I don't want to use it pejoratively in any way, but kind of tribal dynamic in that sense. We are people who belong together. When it comes to, I haven't noticed any kind of misbehavior apart from the normal household kind of squabbles, and even they were minimal. So I think that was kind of peer normative pressure on each other's behavior, rather informal ways of controlling. And I think I was the messiest person in co-living, and everyone was kind to me nonetheless. So all right. Well, I hope, Catherine, I answered at least a bit of what you were asking. I'm not really good in answering questions, but I hope that was close.
That's great. Thanks.
We have one more question from Eva, and it is, how were you able to gain access to the co-living? And I know, Karel, just from personal conversations we've had, that some of the other places that you attempted to gain access gave some interesting insights. So maybe you could talk about that in the 5 minutes that we have left as well.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I think that's what we know for many people who want to engage in ethnography, especially, I guess, kind of organizational ethnography. That's a massive challenge. And it wasn't easy. I was trying to develop relationships with different kind of organizations of this type. Quite often it would lead to some sort of meeting, some sort of chat, but essentially, except of this case, it didn't really lead anywhere. I think partly, it is difficult, right? And accessing organization where people live is challenging. I'm not sure if I would allow a researcher to live in my apartment for 3 months with me. Well, I'm certain I wouldn't. Yeah, so it takes a lot of trying, and it requires patience. And yeah, my supervisors were fairly good in sort of supporting me in trying again until something worked out. If I have this idea that perhaps why it worked partly was that these people were very confident and very interesting group of people who were not were kind of proud of what they do. And we obviously, me and them, have very different ideas about what life is and how it should be lived. But you know, that there was this idea, well, we want to share what is going on. So I think if I can be giving any sort of advice to other ethnographers, go for things that look interesting, and yeah, do not hesitate to ask the people who are kind of on the top of the game, because they might be more likely to say yes. I hope that made any sense.
It did, thank you. I just have one thing just to follow up, if that's okay. Did they mind that you weren't an entrepreneur? How did they deal with that identity?
I think they didn't, because I obviously introduced myself as a sociologist interested in what is happening. I think they tolerated me. I couldn't stay for much. I couldn't stay forever because I was taking space of someone who could actually contribute to entrepreneurial effort. But we developed interesting friendships, and I think I was a curiosity to a certain degree, which might have been interesting for them, as it was obviously interesting for me. I had some suggestions from my fellow housemates that I should actually become more entrepreneurial, and there were suggestions about how I could develop my project into some kind of, you know, the transition of knowledge between the world and academia. But yeah, I don't think I have entrepreneurial bone in me, so I haven't materialized yet.
We are getting towards the end of that time. Karel, are you happy to take a couple more questions?
I am, yeah, but people obviously can leave. I won't be offended, but I'm very happy to continue if people want to. Okay,
Isabel asks in the chat, did you explore their political views? They live in a community bit. It seems we can see some similarities with a gated community. She's curious to see if you explored their view of citizenship in democratic institutions. And I'll read out the last question as well, which is Nicola asks, have you had the chance to look at how the business model evolved in the context of the pandemic? And that we might make that the last one.
Yeah, thank you very much. Political views. No, that was really interesting. They live in community. Yeah, so there's essentially the kind of a perceived contradiction between communal and individualistic, right? Or rather communal but not universal. And that's interesting. I'm not sure if that arose as a conflict in the kind of conceptions of life they entertain, partly because it wasn't necessarily seen as something where we, you know, kind of, how to put it, the kind of vertical segregation, right? It was like, well, we are people who are interested in entrepreneurship, so we should be together, in a similar way as perhaps sometimes academics say, well, you know, we are simply people who are so interested in sociology that we need to create specific spaces, specific conferences, and specific institutions. That was a very interesting thing because when it comes to kind of positions on ideological spectrum, I think I encountered all kinds. But perhaps to my surprise, the kind of what we would perhaps consider center social democratic way of thinking was not exceptional at all. There were perhaps some people who were more right wing when it comes to economic questions, but I didn't have an idea that would be overwhelming. Now, I actually taught quite a few people there. I think 30 years ago, you wouldn't be an entrepreneur. You would be a young, ambitious politician within one of the political parties. But I think that is actually quite telling about how entrepreneurship and this kind of ideology of improvement, innovation, and to a certain degree kind of technocratic solutions are perhaps taking some of that space, or perhaps being attractive for some people who are quite political, who have opinions, but engagement with standard party bureaucracies or with kind of everyday party politics is not their thing. And I think this kind of Silicon Valley ethos was rather strong, right? Politics, yes, but how do we improve the world? It is faster to do it through some kind of technological social change that we can achieve here. I think that would be kind of prevalent idea of how we can act politically on the world there. Have you had the chance to look at how the business model evolved in the context of the pandemic? No, sorry, I haven't. I tried, but then I was, I think the pandemic, I'm sure I'm not the only one, was right overwhelming for many different reasons. But it is an interesting question, and I will explore that further. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Karel. And I think we've had a really fascinating conversation as well. So thank you, everyone, for your questions. As I said at the beginning of today, this is the first of a number of seminars, and Karel's done a great job in kicking us off today, but we want to sort of have this more ongoing conversation about work and life and their balance. And I appreciate that Karel has done a very good job of picking apart the premise of our series of conversations today. But this will be an ongoing conversation. So we hope to see you all again. And Nicola, is there anything you'd like to add? Nope. Fantastic. All right, Karel, is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, I just want to thank everyone for very interesting questions. I think this is a fantastic forum that you have here. So I hope to be joining CRIMT in the future. Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. All right, see you later, everyone.